Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this morning's Employer of Choice session on the topic of storytelling and the new employee experience in collaboration with the Future of Work Institute. Just before I hand you over to Barry, if you don't mind keeping microphones on mute and cameras off, that would be fantastic. But we do really like these sessions to be interactive, so please feel free to pop any questions in the chat box throughout the discussion, and then at the end we'll have a bit of time for questions. I think that is it from me. I hope you all enjoy the session, and I will hand you over to Barry.
Great, thanks very much. Let me see, this is where all things can sometimes fall apart. Oh, it still works. There it is. Hopefully you can all see that, guys. Yeah, is that okay, Jasmine? Everything's working okay there?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. Yeah, so guys, I really want to talk to you today about storytelling and the employee experience, and really I'm going to focus in on two things. One is around this idea of the employer proposition, and then for me, stories that will resonate both inside and out. So a lot of the things I'm going to talk to you about are relevant in terms of what I would call attracting people into your organization, but also then on keeping them in that organization as well. So the reason I always link the proposition and stories together is if we don't really understand our proposition, then it's very hard for us to tell stories that will actually really resonate with individuals in some shape or form. So just a kind of a quick question, and you can kind of answer this via chat. I just want to see how many of you might know this band. You can stick it on chat if you want. One of my favorite bands, little hint, from the 1970s. And I'll give you 10 seconds to see, can you answer that one via chat? We've no music fans here. Very disappointed. There you go. Led Zeppelin. And I think the reason I always show this slide is because stories are very powerful. Symbols are very, very powerful things. And we can tell stories in lots of different ways that really, interest us and attract us. For those of you who are interested, these are the four symbols that represented the four members of the band and became quite iconic actually in the 1970s in terms of these symbols that became synonymous with Led Zeppelin. So the reality is, stories are a really important thing first and foremost, so we all think about storytelling, and often the things we really remember are stories from our families, from our parents, from our friends, wherever that may be. And then oftentimes things that really stick with us are stories, whether we see a film, we read a story, or it's a personal story, wherever that may be. And I think what's really, really interesting from our perspective, we've done a lot of research on this in organizations, big and small. And often we find that, some organizations that don't really have deep stories about their own organization that will actually find like minds. So for me, a lot of storytelling is around how do we get the story of our organization out so we can find people, that have like minds to us, in terms of our culture. We're often seeing weak branding communication strategies within companies, and they're often deployed by the marketing department, which itself is interesting. Whereas what we find is actually that the things that really work really well are when you've got somebody from personnel or HR or from the people experience side working with teams and then working with marketing, but actually directing marketing more than anything else. Linked to that, we often see kind of recruitment strategies that are quite vanilla and not necessarily finding the right candidates. And then when we go a little bit deeper in some of our own work, there's no real connected strategy around what the people experience is or what it's going to be. We might have lots of initiatives within an organization. We're not necessarily seeing about how all that connects together. And I think what's really, really interesting in that perspective, even in some of the most sophisticated organizations that we've worked in, because there's so much stuff floating around and because it's not necessarily connected together, often employees don't even know the value that's open to them within the organization, in terms of that side. And then also we're finding sometimes that there's a lack of alignment and clarity around what the organization is really great at from an employee experience perspective. So really one of the things I really want to cover off today is those elements around how do we start thinking about the, what our employee experience as a proposition, and how can we maybe utilize some strategies to tell some of those stories into the marketplace. Now, this is really, really important, because if you really think about work and how work has evolved, and I spoke about this in our very first session, you know, we've gone to a place where people are really seeking meaningful experiences when it comes to work. And in some instances, they're, you know, seeking some kind of personal transformation. So, you know, we need to create organizations, regardless how big or small they are, that are in some way more than just a career. They're, you know, creating some kind of a meaningful experience that, you know, will keep people interested within our business. Now, obviously, we're in a very highly competitive working environment at the moment, and we've all heard phrases like the Great Resignation, et cetera, et cetera. And we've done a lot of research in this space, and there's lots of different reasons why different elements are happening depending on what sector you're in or whatever. But I do think the more important aspect actually is that there's definitely a continuous move towards, you know, creating a much more human and experiential type workplace. You know, bear in mind from our own research, by about 2035, probably 20 to 25% of us won't actually work, you know, for a large organization. We'll be working as freelancers. You know, and that's because there's lots of changes going on around there. So I think it's really, really important, first and foremost, is to recognize that, you know, if we want to create an organization that's of interest to people, then we need to put a little bit more focus on the proposition that we're going to offer those people. And then we really need to kind of join the dots in terms of the stories that we're going to tell. Just a little bit of context here. If you think about where we are now from a, you know, recruitment perspective even. So let's just take the awareness side of, you know, somebody getting to know your organization, right? On average, they're going to look at about 18 sources and read about 7 to 8 reviews. That's even before, you know, people start actually applying. So really the journey starts anywhere where the employer story can be found. So we need to make sure that the employer story and our proposition at least is somewhat memorable. And I'm going to go into that in a good bit of depth, because even the smallest organization, and this is really, really important point, even the smallest organization will have 3 or 4 things about that organization that are quite special. And sometimes, you know, what we do is we don't maybe take the time to think about how we can actually craft that into a proposition, communicate that in a really interesting way out into the marketplace. So we actually, you know, miss opportunities. So we can actually, regardless of size, you know, if we're a big, you know, organization, if we're a small organization, we can position ourselves at least to be a little bit more memorable in the minds of the kind of candidates that we would like to work with in our organization. Now, this is a really important slide, and it's often kind of jumped past. So when I talk about proposition and stories and brand, right, let's just assume for this moment in time we're talking about brand, we're talking about how we represent our organization internally and externally through stories. There's an awful lot of time spent probably on the brand side. You know, how do we get out there? You know, how do we make sure that we're on the right social channels? You know, we're actually interacting with the right type of candidates. You know, they're in the right space, etc. And that is absolutely important. But actually, it's only one part of the equation. The other part of the equation, to me, which is equally, if not more important, is this thing called the people value proposition. Some of you might know it as the employer value proposition. We call it the people value proposition. And for me, the people value proposition is around what's the value that people get by working in and staying in our organization. So the people value proposition at one hand is quite strategic, right? Because in there, we're going to have to understand what are those key aspects of value that we're really good at, you know, that keep our people engaged. What are our people saying about the value that they get within their organization? What are the things that make us quite unique as a business? And that's strategic, right? Because, you know, if we're in HR, we might say, well, we need to maybe look at some of those elements of the people value proposition and dial it up a bit, you know, or we maybe need to dial down on something, or maybe we're missing something totally that's really, really important to the people that are within our organization and the people that will be maybe interested in joining our organization. So we always have 2 elements here when we talk about this idea of, you know, stories and proposition, and it's always both, you know. And I think if we've got a weak value proposition, or we haven't thought about that in a very structured way, then we'll have a vanilla brand, right? We'll have this kind of generic brand. And a really good example of this, you know, I know you guys are in the life sciences sector, you know, oftentimes when I speak to people in the life science sector, you know, for them, you know, it's really unique for them that they can say we save people's lives, right? And that's absolutely a big mission, right? It's a really important mission. But actually, even within that, there are a number of organizations that are doing that in some shape or form. But my next question is always, what uniquely are you doing within that space? And what does that mean to the employees within your business? So we need to move away from just broad-based kind of stories to kind of, well, what's our unique element of what we're about? So that's really what I want to focus on today. 2 questions, and I'm going to give you kind of some models maybe to help you start thinking about things in a maybe slightly different way. So what value does an employee or potential employee gain by working in your organization? And how ultimately do we get that value across through stories? And so, as I said to you, first thing to have in your head is those 2 elements, right? The value proposition and then the story brand element. Both of those are really, really important. So the first thing I really want to talk about is the people value proposition. Here's a little bit of a definition for you. It's the total design of the value that people receive when they join and stay in a business. So it's both financial and non-financial. It's the essence, the experience, it's the culture and the story of an organization all rolled into one. And I think oftentimes people don't recognize the size of the canvas that we have to play on when it comes about understanding what our current people value proposition is and how we need to maybe evolve that people value proposition over time. So we have done a lot of work in this space, and we've identified 20 areas that are important in terms of attracting and keeping people within the organization. And only a few of those areas are related to pay and benefits, the usual suspects. And I think that's the first most important thing for me. There's, if you think about it a little bit like a painter's canvas, right? We've actually got 20 areas that we can play with, that we can paint. And I think, we can look at something like culture and values is actually part of a proposition. It's part of something that is important to a cohort of an audience, right? On that side, things like sustainability obviously become much more important. And strong CSR practices within an organization is another thing that's become very important. 20 years ago, we wouldn't hear about things like organizational wellness, but that now has become an important part of proposition to people. And we hear about things like wellness days and all this kind of stuff that we wouldn't have heard about 20 years before. So I think the first thing that we need to recognize in terms of the people proposition, the value that we can give to employees and to potential employees, is we've actually got 20 areas to kind of play with. And the reason it's kind of shown like this, and I'm going to kind of talk through a bit of a case study in a minute, is next question is, well, where are we across each of these value proposition areas? What do we believe that we're very good at, or maybe we're world class on? What are those areas that we think we've got something a little bit unique in there? So, just to kind of top line give you, and this presentation, I should say, guys, will be sent to you after the talk by Jasmine, and obviously just for sharing within the One Nucleus family. I think these are some of the areas that make up those 20 areas. These are the descriptions of each of those 20 areas that we can play. So an obvious one that comes up an awful lot obviously at the moment is work-life balance, and we're all moving into a much more flexible working environment. So that's something that's obviously become a lot bigger. And actually in most sectors, from our own research, it's probably a top 5 requirement now, in terms of across the 20 areas. There's other really interesting ones for me that often people miss. So for example, meaningful and stimulating work. As an organization, how are we making sure that people are working on, interesting projects, something that's meaningful? How are we connecting the work that they're doing to the purpose of the organization? Another one people forget about is, our leadership behaviors, how are they actually supporting our environment? Interesting enough, from our own work, a number of people will leave, a large cohort of people will leave because of leadership behaviors. And they could be toxic leadership behaviors in one business unit. There could be an overall challenge around, how leadership has evolved and creating a particular type of culture. So I think the really important thing for me is that we've actually got 20 areas that we can play with. And one of the things that I really love to think about after this kind of presentation is, when you sit back and you get this presentation, you have a look at those 20 spokes, what areas of the employee value proposition, are you either good at or excellent today? And I absolutely guarantee that regardless of the size of your business, you'd be able to call out 4 to 5 areas. And I always like to do a quick authenticity test. You know, if you were to speak to 5 people in the business, would they agree that that was an area that you're really good at or really excellent at? You know, and you have some kind of formal approach in that area. I think that's a really important one. So if for example, we say, you know what, we have got this, you know, absolutely amazing social environment, right, which is one of the areas, you know, it's not just we go to the pub the odd time. You know, what it means is you've got some kind of a formal mechanism for driving social interaction, either virtually or physically, or something else in between. So I think the first thing I'd really love you guys to think about after this call, and if you forget about everything else that I'm saying, is number one is, you know what, we need to think from a proposition perspective, the same way as we think about our propositions to our customers. We also have an employer proposition, whether we like it or not. You know, it's really beneficial if we plot that value proposition and highlight the areas that we're really, really strong in. Because actually that then becomes the basis of our strategy, both internally in terms of, you know, working on those areas, or maybe looking at gaps that we have within our overall employee proposition. And then it also becomes a basis for some of our communications internally and externally to kind of position ourselves into the marketplace in a quite a unique way. So, you know, for example, this is from a life sciences organization, actually, funnily enough, that we've been working with. This represents their, you know, some of their support, you know, and they would consider themselves, you know, very good on the wellness scale, if we want to call it that. And again, this is an example of, you know, evidence in action here. They have a formalized approach in terms of work life and well-being, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it's to have that kind of test where you kind of go, actually, you know what, there's something, you know, we have something here that we could turn into something important to candidates or to our current employees within the current business. What I will do, guys, I do see some kind of pieces coming up on the Zoom. I'll come to the questions at the end, if that's okay. So it means that we might have a bit more time at the end to have a proper discussion. So again, you know, the big question for me is, what are those areas that today you guys are really strong at? You know, this is just, and again, another example of a case study where, you know, business that we're working with, very, very strong on a very mission and purpose driven business. So very much connected to improving a particular part of the patient life cycle. I won't say which one that is, because I don't want to kind of talk too much about what client it is. Culture, very, very quirky. You know, and definitely got some kind of a fun atmosphere in terms of the culture, something quite unique in there as well. You know, definitely it's a very much in that kind of what I would call early stage R&D space. So it's a very great environment for meaningful and stimulating work. And then from a work-life balance perspective, there's a lot of focus on flexibility and fitting family around, you know, the work as well as everything else in a very formal factor. So, you know, if you think about your own organization, you could probably pick 4 or 5 areas yourself that you believe are good or very good in that area. So, you know, one of the things I always kind of like to say to people is, you know, map your value proposition, your employee value proposition using those 20 areas. Get a good sense of where you are today. Now, this is really interesting. Another organization we're working with, we kind of started by getting groups of people together, 2 business units within the same organization. I've mapped very, very different employer value propositions, you know, from their perspective. So you can see, you know, the further out the plot goes, the higher it is in terms of it's good or it's very good or it's great, you know, in terms of the areas that we focus on. And oftentimes that we find that, number one, there's lack of alignment around what the value proposition for employees actually is, right, around the leadership team even. So even by conducting a process like this, which you can do in a workshop environment, you know, or talking to a number of people, you get to a place where you kind of go, hey, this kind of looks like our employer value proposition, right? You know, are we focusing on the right areas here? You know, are we doing the best we can in some of these areas? What areas here are important to the kind of candidates that we're getting or that we've gotten? You know, it's always worth speaking to your employees around, you know, why did you join this place and why are you staying? And, you know, their answers will fall across some of these 20 areas. And I often get spoken to by, you know, HR leads and, you know, leaders around, you know, we've loads of initiatives. And I always say, look, what value proposition are you trying to create, and then worry about the initiatives that you're going to kind of, develop out. So, for example, if we're in a startup situation and we have a real issue around leadership behaviors and that side of things, we really need to focus in on that, right? We really need to kind of work on that to make that a really important aspect of our value proposition. And people aren't going to join us because they've heard about our leadership team. There's poor reviews out there on, on our Glassdoor reviews or in social, wherever that may be, which is hurting our ability to, attract those candidates. So again, even starting the plot gives us understanding, and then by having understanding, we can start to understand where we are and where we need to go. It's a bit like the old Alice in Wonderland thing, unless we know where we are, we don't know where we're going. So again, an example of a plot, all of you within your own organizations will be able to create a fairly similar plot in shorthand, just to kind of get your thoughts around that. And I think the big thing for me is that, it's not about at this stage detail, because, this can be a long or a short process. It's actually just about starting the step towards a much more purposeful design, right, of an employer value proposition, and really starting to think about it in that way. And it gives you an ability to kind of prioritize areas, to fix particular areas, to research into areas. And there's other areas where you might ignore, it might pretty strongly, what we're doing there is good. It's not something we need to worry about too much, right? So, you can kind of start thinking strategically, about the overall kind of people value proposition. And I think, again, asked a lot around, how do we make our approach to people much more strategic? Using some kind of a canvas like this definitely helps in terms of, focusing efforts, prioritizing things, putting more effort into other areas. So that's again an example of a plot in real time. I think there's another important aspect to me that I just want to call out on this. Oftentimes the companies that we're working with, there's obviously a big difference between what you have, what you want, and what you actually need, within the business, right? So, a number of organizations, as you probably recognize now, are moving towards a much more flexible working type model, right? I mentioned there kind of before that it's definitely a top 5, ask, if we want to call it that, a top 5 actually decision-making criteria as to why somebody would join an organization. So oftentimes, we might want to maybe put a lot of focus in on our D&I efforts early days, which is absolutely important, but we might need actually a flexible model to actually attract the kind of the candidates that we maybe are struggling to get because we're a small organization or because we're working in a particular area that's a little bit less well known or wherever that may be. So oftentimes, what we have, what we want, and what we need are actually different, right? And I always like to say, start with what you actually need. Start with what you need to have in place to keep people within your organization. Start with what you need to have as a bare minimum to make your organization interesting as a place for other people to come along. So, the only reason I call these 3 out is because, these 3 are often not thought about maybe the flexible working is thought about in this way. But if you look at meaningful work and leadership behaviors, they're not necessarily thought about in the context of, keeping people or attracting people into the business. Whereas actually from our own work, we often find that, strong leaders who are right there talking about the business, and interacting with your communities around this are the ones that actually really attract talent into the business. And then that aspect around leadership work and it keeps people in there. So always have that thing in your head around, look, this is where we are, this is what we have. And let's have a discussion around what we want versus what we really need to kind of drive this business forward. So again, having those elements within the discussion is really, really important. Now, the PVP is only part of a process. And I would say, when we do projects like this and we start thinking about, well, what's the overall kind of, essence of the organization? We like to cover, what I would call, 5 core areas, right? And that would be for me, the people value proposition, which we talked about, and you would normally workshop that or interact with people on that. What's your personality within the business? So, any businesses that we work with have a kind of an existing culture or a set of behaviors. You might have a strong brand in a particular area. That's got to be an input there. You're going to have your values, and associated elements to that. You're going to have an existing social footprint in some shape or form. Somebody might have made some comments about you on Glassdoor. If you're a big organization, there might be hundreds of commentary around Glassdoor. That's a really interesting, and LinkedIn, they're really interesting kind of sources because you can kind of find themes, you can find big areas that you might go, okay, that's interesting. There's a bit of a there's a real, a real trend here that, people are talking about our business around that we've got really brilliant projects and meaningful work. So that's definitely something that's part of who we are. There's things like attractors research that we do a lot of, what's actually attracting to people to my business today, what's it going to be like in 5 years, what will we need there, and again, all of these things have kind of a time element. So if you think about 20 years ago, wellness, flexible working, sustainability, pretty low down, in terms of an element that you can play with or would be important to the organization and attracting people, now very much moving up in terms of, needs and wants. And then there's obviously the sectoral bit as well. So oftentimes, and particularly in these markets, we're starting to see how organizations are trying to attract people from, other sectors, right? You know what I mean? So you really need to understand, what's the sectoral drivers? Why do people move into the sector in the first place anyway? What's kind of all that about? Now, the reason I'm calling all these things out is because if we've got these elements, that enables us then to start moving into the second part of the equation, which is storytelling or stories. And for me, we need to kind of, how do we tell tales about our organization? Now that we know what our value proposition is, or we know maybe what our 5 or 6 strong things are that we have, and then also we might know a bit more about the personality of the business. And there's loads of really interesting kind of techniques to tell tales, as I like to say. And here's some examples from theme park design, from screenplays, from production, from comic books. I won't go through them all, but I just want to give you a few to kind of maybe think about and start thinking about what they are in the context of your business. So the first one is themes. And, if you think about Disneyland or, some kind of a theme park, they generally have these different thematic islands, or areas, right, that they use. And, for me, it's a really powerful way of getting your business across. And for me, in this context, a theme are these islands that connect the overall employer story to focused promotion. So for example, we're working with a business at the moment where these are the 3 themes that we've landed on. Quirky, different. So they're very, very different in terms of their culture. It's quirky, it's a bit off the wall. A purposeful place, so it's very much focused on a very, very big and meaningful purpose. And then this idea of patient heroes, so they do a lot of focus on co-creation with their patient bodies, etc., etc. So all of a sudden we've got 3 themes that we can use as the basis to our communications out into the marketplace. And I think one of the things when we talk about telling stories out into the market, it doesn't always have to be the same story, because if we've got 3 themes, first few months we might talk about how things are a bit quirky, how things are a bit different within this environment. Then we might talk about, or we might have a leader talking about, how this is a very purpose-driven business. We're really going after something big. Our mission is to change the world in some shape or form. Or we might have, patient stories that work with us in some short space or form. So teams, would be unique to your own organization. But it helps us then to be able to tell interesting stories from that side. So I'd love you to think about, once you've done your plot and you've sketched something out on the back of a napkin or whatever way you want to do it, then you think about, God, of those value proposition elements, what really are our teams? Have we got a really cool culture, and what does it feel like? What does it look like? Are we focused on this area, that area, etc. And that will then help you kind of start thinking about those themes that you want to get out onto your social feed. And this will impact everything from how you write your job descriptions, all the way through to maybe the next advertisement that you're going to stick onto a social piece, or the next way you talk to somebody going through the employee journey. The second really powerful thing is from comic books, is what I call the origin story. And again, oftentimes we don't talk enough about where our company has come from. They're really powerful tools for getting people interested in your business, but also, how do current employees find your organization? How did they come across it? What's their origin stories working within your business? And equally, what stories have you lost, because of the people retired or left? So we need to think about stories in that context as well. How the organization was set up, how people created their own careers within that business, what it means. And that's a really, really powerful way of thinking about things. This is an example again of another organization, not in the life sciences sector, but in the tech side of things, and they talk about this whole idea of not being set up in a garage but in a barn, right? But again, really interesting, kind of origin story that they will use across different areas, in terms of their marketing approach as well. So, origin story is another great way of, talking about your business. Origin stories in terms of how employees have worked throughout their career in your business or otherwise. I think another really interesting one for me, just to take a music example, I don't know if anybody knows who Neil Rogers is, but he's a big producer. He's worked with everybody from, you know, David Bowie to Madonna and everybody else in between. But he used to do this thing called, you know, hunting for the deep hidden truth, you know, so they could create some kind of really interesting songs. And every organization I've worked with have got deep hidden truths, right? And how do you get to them? Well, you know, talk to your best employees about you and your business and why they stay and why they've come here. And also talk to your toughest employee. We all have those, you know, the ones that are always a little bit annoyed about working in your particular organization. And from those conversations, you'll find some really interesting truths about the company, something unique about the business that you can then tell, you know, in a story in some shape or form as well. You know, this is an example of, again, another organization working on the life sciences piece that really are talking about their own story, you know, but through their illness, right? And the organization that they've kind of, you know, worked with and co-created with. Again, finally, and this is the one I really want to kind of really want you to think about, is this idea of a show Bible. You know, if you were to, and the show Bible basically is a tool that's used to sell, you know, potential TV series to executives. And normally it's a 20-page document. It's got imagery that will represent, you know, the TV series to create the atmosphere. It will talk about the tone of the piece. It will talk about the style. It will talk about the different players within it, etc., etc. This one is actually the original TV show Bible for the Stranger Things video. And the thing I always like to ask people is, what would your show Bible be if you're to write one for your organization? What images would you use? How would you talk about your organization, you know, in a very meaningful way? And we're actually doing a lot of these types of projects at the moment with clients where we're writing their show Bible for the employee experience, right? You know, what you're going to get from working within our business, you know, what is it going to feel like, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it's moving into that experiential element that I mentioned at the start, is how do we create these kind of experiences that, you know, will keep people with us, you know, will attract the different types of people that we need to work in the business. So I'd love you to think about those kind of 4 elements, even just to start, you know, what are our core themes that we get out there that kind of is based on our value proposition that makes us really unique? You know, what are some of the origin stories of our organization and how employees have created their career within our organization? You know, what's some of the deep hidden truths behind what we're about? And then what would our show Bible look like, you know, if we were to kind of, you know, create one for our business, whether it's a 3-pager or a 20-pager, it doesn't matter, you know, we can go as kind of man as you'd like. And all of a sudden now we've got a source of stories that will kind of position ourselves in the marketplace and also internally to our people, because, you know, a lot of this work is not just about the external element, it's also about internally engaging with people, you know, creating stories that will actually, you know, get people involved and more involved on that side. And again, an example of a one in the life sciences space, what to expect from a people-centered organization. And I just want to give one simple example before I finish up, just to give you a sense of how you can quickly, you know, take something like a story and put it into even a role in a job description. So let's say, for argument's sake, we find mission and purpose to culture, the meaning for work and work-life balance as a key 4 aspects of our own organization within the business, and we decide to write the top of our job description. All of a sudden we can kind of go mission-driven business, big purpose to help people and small digital business owners, you know, succeed and make some serious dosh. Okay, you know, if you like an environment that's off the wall, collaborative and focused, where you'll find exciting and sometimes weird projects that will help you expand the business from day one, blah, blah, blah. So all of a sudden we can create, you know, a unique footprint for our business, even through one artifact, like a job description, that actually gets across the personality of our business, you know, to the right types of people. And I always like to say that, you know, when we're talking about organizations, to me, they're a little bit like Marmite, right? We're not trying to appeal to everybody. What we're trying to do is we're trying to appeal to the people that will help grow our business, you know, within the construct that we have culturally, you know, and in here in terms of how we actually kind of do things on that side. So, you know, I think the reality for me is that one small step towards a little bit more structure in terms of what your value proposition is, and in terms of linking those stories to the value proposition, has all sorts of very well defined benefits. And these are some of the ones that we've seen with the companies that we're working with. You know, you're going to broaden your pool and you're going to attract the people that you need. You're going to decrease time to hire. You're going to improve, employees' morale within the organization because you've got a structure range of value proposition. You'll improve your retention, reduce costs of hiring, and everything else in between. So I think for me, it's all about taking that first step. So for me, the first step would be to say, what actually is our value proposition? So before we start talking about our business out there and, we get our CEO up there talking about what we're about and our culture and all that kind of stuff, what actually is our value proposition? What actually does make us unique? What are the areas that are really strong? And that foundational element then will help you create strategies for greater levels of retention and engagement. Will create strategies for communication and brand, and your teams and everything kind of else out there. So guys, with that, I'm going to call it a day. I do always like people to kind of contact me directly if you have any ideas or any perspectives. I really, really appreciate that. I think, Jasmine, I've managed to keep to my time more or less. I did say half an hour. So, hopefully, guys, that all makes sense. As I said, that first step is the key. Sketching that value proposition out is really the important first step. So with that, Jasmine, I'll hand back to you. Thanks, Jasmine.
Thanks, Barry. It was a really interesting presentation and actually really kind of thought-provoking, and great to hear the different strategies that we can perhaps use to not only engage with our team, but also with our members and things like that. I really like the point about enabling people in HR to have greater strategic impact, but who is kind of responsible for empowering those people and enabling the HR? Is that the management team that is kind of sitting with them to be driving this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, where this works well is where HR are the orchestrator, I like to say, but they get early involvement from the leadership team. And you might have a 4-person leadership team or a 12-person leadership team. And what's really interesting is that, because there's always a lot of fear when you get kind of senior executives together, but actually it's one of those things that's so fundamental to a business that the least that will happen is you'll have really great collaborative conversations with that leadership team and really start them thinking, actually, what is our value proposition to our people, and where are we going with this, and why does that make sense for where we are today? Because the other thing I should have said, Desmond, is that, depending on where you are, like you might be a scale-up business or you might be a well-established business, there's a time element to this as well. So what worked maybe in the scale-up side and what you were focused on your value proposition might need to be, refreshed in your kind of, your growth cycle or your stable cycle, so there's an element there as well. But definitely kind of number one, a recognition that the employer value proposition, the people value proposition is as important as your customer value proposition, and then working with the leadership team to get this kind of at least an initial aligned view on what it actually is and where you're trying to get to. They're really meaningful conversations, and any of the kind of working sessions I've been involved in, they're always a kind of a positive, meaningful discussion, right? You know what I mean? As opposed to, oh, that's, the usual initiative discussions I call, oh yeah, let's do a bit there, a bit there. This is much more fundamental. And I do think that, when people talk to me about how can HR be more strategic, I think the big thing for me is around utilizing this more value proposition approach to kind of, and through that process, show HR being more strategic, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Because I've worked with some amazing HR people. So, but sometimes it's a bit like, my background is in strategy. So it's a different profession, so it's like, how do you kind of filter some of that to a HR person that really makes them effective, where they're trying to get to, and I am always frustrated often where, we've gone to a place, I think, where often HR is at the leadership table, but sometimes it's not necessarily seen in the same context, as the sales, as the, product development side of things as well. So, I think that there's a great opportunity there on this side as well. Long answer, Jasmine, apologies, but I want to get it all out there. The longer the answer, the less questions I get asked. So.
That's perfect. Thank you, Barry. We have had one other question in the group and in the chat, and it's how does the dimension of diversity, inclusion, and belonging measure up today?
That's a really really good question. Can I be bold on this now a little bit? I think look, as we all know, right, there's a political drive towards greater diversity and inclusion, right? And that's absolutely critical in a modern society, right? I do think that in many of the organizations I work with, I do think there's still a bit of brand diversity and inclusion. So we talk a lot about it, I'm not convinced about the impact of some of those programs that are run within that context. And oftentimes I see businesses that have diversity that aren't actually harnessing that diversity in any meaningful way. One of our businesses within the CPI group actually has I think it's got over 65 nationalities working within that business. And, really, there's lots of things going on, but one of their big effective programs actually was what they call cultural learning. So it was literally somebody from a particular culture would cook a meal from their culture, talk about the meal, talk about the ingredients, and talk about bam, bam, bam. And all of a sudden, there was a greater level of cultural awareness. But what it was actually doing was increasing the communications between those different elements, creating that sense of belonging. So I think it's really interesting you said diversity, inclusion, and belonging, because I think sometimes the gap is between the D bit and the belonging bit, and I'd like to see kind of more meaningful programs that actually harness diversity. So for example, right, and this is a great, really practical, and I always think about, how are we going about picking our teams for projects? Very simple question, right? Really simple, right? 20 years ago, it used to be, we need the best people in the project, right? But actually, we should be asking ourselves, what are the kind of diverse voices that we need on this project? What are the voices that will give us a holistic approach to this particular project? That simple question is a question I ask of a number of leaders in organizations, and often they don't have the answer to me. They say, we get the best people, and blah, blah, blah. I said, but that's quite old school thinking. How do you get the most diverse group of people working on that? And then the second thing I'd also say then is, a lot of the work we've done and a lot of the research we've looked at is diverse teams work really well as long as there's proper structures in place. So if you've got a diverse team, that's not necessarily measure success. If you have a diverse team, plus you've got the models to harness that diversity, then you've got the kind of magic. So I would challenge organizations to start with that simple question, right? How are we harnessing diversity in our project teams? It's a really simple question, but that to me then gets you more into that belonging piece, right? Okay, get you more into that, I'm feeling now part of this diverse team that's challenging, that makes me feel part of something meaningful, bam, bam, bam. So hopefully that answers your question, but I'm happy as well, Jasmine, to send some stuff over to you guys as well on that topic, so you can kind of share that over with the team as well.
That would be great. Thank you, Barry. And thank you, Catherine, for the question.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine.
If please feel free to hop on, or if there's anything else you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, yeah, absolutely agree that was my experience. So it was kind of interesting to, hear that you've got some information that supports that, the difference between brand that everybody talks about it, when you actually start to get in there, it's not really, it's
really annoying, Catherine. Like, it is really annoying. I don't know if you've seen, I'm sure you've seen, well, maybe you didn't, Tim Cook's been banging on about diversity for all week. And if you actually look at the director group in Apple, in their there's 2 women out of, I think, 14 members, right? And even that level of so you're kind of going, well, so there's a disconnect between, Catherine, a lot of the communications we're seeing and then the reality behind the scenes. I would actually prefer to see more honest leadership, in terms of where we actually are, what I mean? And then kind of ask those first principle questions, and like I've been in a couple of situations where I've actually seen real diversity in action on important mission critical projects, where those projects wouldn't have got to where they were, without that team. So it's very interconnected. And I think, that to me is kind of what I would call, I think when you start bringing that into what I call business performance versus political performance, because there's a lot of, you need to tick the boxes here, versus business performance. When it gets to business performance, a little bit like the sustainability agenda, then you get kind of all sorts of magic happening. Do you know what I mean on that side? So that would be.
And your point about structure is definitely is right, as well as some research I think that shows, in the initial parts of a team, it's like the team forming, storming, norming.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you get a diverse team, then it actually doesn't perform as well as a non-diverse team in the initial stages. And it's only as time goes on that the performance goes up. So
and actually, you know what, Catherine, I'm glad you make that point, actually, because that has done a lot. So again, it's funny in a way, because all of the elements we talked about are interconnected, right? So poor leadership is the reason that diversity in projects hasn't worked, right? Because, you know, ultimately it's up for leaders to create the frameworks for people to collaborate, right? So, you know, and then it was like, oh, well, that didn't work. You know, we tried this big diverse project of 50 people across the world and all things fall apart. I said, but you didn't lead. You didn't put the structure in place, you know. So that's me being popular, Catherine, sorry, but you know what I mean? So I do think, you know, I do think it's almost like this untapped resource that, you know, and sometimes almost people are afraid to step up and lead and create the frameworks for that, right? You know, and even at a, you know, let's take the cultural level of diversity, right? Like the richness that's in there, right? But also remember the very differing styles of working that's in there, right? So if you look at the Hofstede matrix for Brazil versus Ireland, just as an example, or the UK, Ireland and the UK have similar aspects in terms of the Hofstede matrix, which basically measures 8 areas of culture, right? And you look at the differences between the cultural norms there, there's magic and there's madness. Do you know what I mean? So like, if you bring those groups of people together and there's no structure or framework or understanding during that norming phase, it's a mess. If you create those understanding lens, it's magic, you know. So I always like the cultural diversity, you know, and any type of diversity is to, you know, there's 2 paths, you know, magic or madness. You know, no leadership equals madness, strong leadership equals magic, you know. So that would be my take on it.
That's great. I've got another question if you haven't got any other ones, but I don't want to hog the stage as well.
Go for
it. Easy question, Catherine, if that's okay.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of the other thing that, you know, must be a challenge is that in the life science industry as a sector, we're all very proud, I guess, of the connection with patients. Yes. So, you know, even your example was, again, you know, it comes up with the patient and that patient focus and it's linked to the meaning as well, of course, you know, there's another intersection, and it's linked to the meaning and meaningful, purposeful work. So, you know, I guess the question, how do you kind of balance that off with the unique value proposition that you're trying to create and standing out amongst the life science crowd, or do you have to?
No, I think that's a great question, Catherine, and there's various perspectives on that, right? So, like first and foremost, at a sectoral level, right? You guys have got a serious chutzpah in the sense that you do this transformational work for patients, right? So I always like to say straight away, you're 2 steps ahead of most sectors, right? And I really mean that, right? Because that is an important aspect here, because we look a lot at kind of sector level dynamics as well. And, you know, always when you look at the life sciences sector, that mission, you know, purpose driven stuff is always up there, right? It's always there because it's part and parcel of what you're about, because ultimately you're transforming people's lives. So I think there's a sectoral aspect here, but also I do think there's opportunities for organizations, you know, specific organizations to really hone in on, you know, and I always use this word specifically because it's an important word, like specifically, how are you working with the patients? You know, specifically, how are you transforming their lives? Specifically, how does that link with the culture of the people that are within your business, right? And I think that, you know, it's almost like asking the 5 whys, Catherine, but applied to your own business. And I do think you'll find magic there if you kind of keep that. And it's like, it's a really annoying thing. And I've been in a number of these kind of things with life sciences companies where they're almost throwing me out the door because they're kind of going, look, we stop kind of, you know, it's just the patients, you know. I said, no. And then you land and they go, well, actually, hold on a minute, actually, we do something quite unique in terms of how we co-create patients for this particular, you know, kind of set of, you know, of solutions, let's call them, you know, because it can be anything. Well, so actually, we need to kind of talk about that a bit more. So all of a sudden, you kind of do create that uniqueness. So I do think, Catherine, whilst it's really, you know, it's commendable that life sciences are very much, you know, focused on, you know, people's lives and human health and all that kind of stuff. There's always your aspect of it that you can really kind of pull out there. And I think the other thing I'd also say is when you take that then plus the other elements that make you unique, you've got quite a unique story. So if you take those 20 areas and you take the, I don't know how many thousand, I think it's about 200,000 businesses, small and medium-sized businesses in the UK, you've got probably about 2.8 billion combinations of stories, you know, across, you know, those businesses. So, you know, for me, it's making sure you're continuously, you know, thinking holistically about your, you know, what you are and what makes you unique, you know. So hopefully that answers the question, Catherine. I think, Jasmine, maybe I'll send a couple of, I'll double check, but I should be able to send a couple of examples of that specificity in action, Catherine. If I can, I will send them on to you. So it would be helpful. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you. If we haven't got any other questions, I'll do one last call now. But otherwise, I think we will wrap up the session.
Thanks very much.
Um,
Yeah,
but
thanks, Jasmine.
yeah, just to say thank you again, Barry. It was a really fantastic presentation, and yeah, looking forward to the next one. I think we're looking at maybe October or November, so we hope to see.
I'm hoping to hop over actually the end of October to see you all, so I'm looking forward to that. And great being in your company, guys, for the last hour. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you everyone for joining, and have a lovely rest of the day.
See you guys. Thanks, Jasmine.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, guys. Bye.